What's up, everybody? Back on the channel. Iran just threatened to shut down a second global oil choke point that has nothing to do with the Strait of Hormuz. And if that threat turns out to be real rather than posturing, this stops being a regional shipping story and becomes a global one. Before I get into any of it, same rule as always on this channel. Confirmed statements first, independent shipping and satellite data second, and anywhere the picture is genuinely murky, I'm going to tell you flat out that it's murky. No borrowing confidence from a press release just because it makes for a cleaner story. Let's get into it. Start with where things actually stand right now, because the raw shape of this week is almost hard to hold in your head all at once. As of Wednesday night, the United States had completed its fifth consecutive day of strikes on Iran. This round specifically built around degrading Tehran's ability to threaten commercial shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. CENTCOM's own language was direct. Forces struck Iranian command centers, air defense sites, missile and drone capabilities, and coastal surveillance facilities, hitting multiple locations, including the port city of Bandar Abbas. Earlier that same day, a separate 90-minute operation hit Greater Tunb Island, one of a handful of small islands Iran has used for years to help anchor its claim over passage through the strait. Read that again because it matters. This wasn't one strike. It was two distinct waves in a single day, on top of 4 previous days of expanding operations. And by Thursday morning local time, air defenses were activating in parts of Tehran itself, a city that until this week had mostly been sitting outside the active strike zone, while the fighting concentrated in the south. Layered on top of the air campaign, the U.S. reimposed a full naval blockade of Iranian ports this week. And this is the part I think gets underweighted in a lot of the coverage, because it's not as visually dramatic as a bomb going off, but it might matter more strategically than anything else happening right now. As part of enforcing that blockade, American forces disabled a Curacao-flagged commercial tanker, identified as the Belma, that was attempting to reach Kharg Island while allegedly ignoring multiple warnings and trying to skirt the blockade altogether. Kharg Island is not just another dot on the map. It is functionally Iran's entire oil export lifeline, the single most important piece of infrastructure keeping crude revenue flowing into a government that is simultaneously trying to fund a shooting war. Hitting a vessel headed there isn't about degrading a radar system or a missile battery. It's about squeezing the actual money, and during the last blockade period earlier this year before the interim ceasefire, CENTCOM said it had redirected 142 ships and disabled 9 that refused to comply over a roughly 2-month stretch. That's the scale this kind of operation can reach once it's fully running, and this week it's running again, with the military saying it redirected 2 more vessels in just the first 24 hours of reinforcing it. Here's a detail that I think tells you more about the actual state of negotiations than almost anything else this week. Right before that blockade snapped back into place, Trump reversed a plan to charge a 20% fee on ships transiting the strait, an idea that had reportedly been quietly undercut by his own Secretary of State only weeks earlier, and that played directly into Tehran's own narrative about wanting control over the waterway. Trump said he'd pursue trade and investment deals with Gulf states instead, framing it as the product of what he called highly productive conversations with regional leadership. So you've got the U.S. simultaneously enforcing a blockade with strikes on one hand and cutting commercial deals with the exact same neighborhood on the other. That's not really a contradiction once you sit with it. It's pressure on Tehran specifically, paired with incentives for everybody standing next to Tehran, run on parallel tracks at the same time. It's worth remembering that just a few weeks before any of this, on June 17th, Trump and Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian had actually signed a memorandum of understanding, sometimes referred to in reporting as the Islamabad Memorandum, meant to end the earlier war and lift the blockade entirely. That deal held for less than 3 weeks before it started coming apart over exactly the same question that's driving this entire current phase: who actually controls passage through the strait and on whose terms? Let's talk numbers, because the human and economic cost behind this week's headlines is where the story stops being abstract. Kepler, the maritime tracking firm that monitors global shipping in real time, recorded only 21 vessels transiting the Strait of Hormuz on a single day this week, a fraction of what normally moves through a corridor that typically carries something close to a fifth of the entire world's oil and gas supply. The same firm has confirmed 56 verified attacks in the region since this phase of the crisis reignited, and 17 seafarer fatalities, 17 people who went to work in cargo ships and container vessels and did not come home. I want to sit on that number for a second longer than the news cycle usually allows, because it's easy to let a statistic like that slide past in a sentence about oil prices, and it deserves better than that. One of those deaths has a name and a hometown now. The crew of the Cyprus-flagged container ship GFS Galaxy, which was set ablaze by an IRGC strike earlier this month, included a missing crew member from Pune, India, whose body was recovered by the Omani Navy and confirmed dead on July 14th. On the Iranian side, state media reported that strikes this week killed an Iranian Navy lieutenant, Hamidreza Dagani, at the southern port of Jask. An honest accounting of this conflict has to hold both of those facts at once, not just the one that fits whichever narrative is more convenient to reach for. Oil markets are telling their own version of this story. Brent crude was trading close to $85 a barrel this week, hovering near its highest level in roughly a month, even with the U.S. actively working to keep the strait open by force. That's an important signal, because it means global markets aren't pricing this as a contained or resolved situation. They're pricing in genuine ongoing risk, and that risk premium is exactly the kind of pressure Tehran's entire Hormuz strategy has always been built around generating. Now let's get to the hook, because this is where the week actually turns into something bigger than a shipping dispute. Iran's Revolutionary Guard put out a statement this week warning that the United States should expect other oil and gas export routes serving American and allied interests to be closed as well, saying plainly that the region's oil and gas exports will either be available to everyone or to no one. That statement didn't name a specific waterway, but a senior Houthi official in Yemen said explicitly, in an interview carried on Iranian state media, that Yemen's armed forces were prepared to close the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the narrow gateway connecting the Red Sea to the Gulf of Aden, if Saudi Arabia continued its own strikes on Yemeni territory, and warned that doing so alongside a continued Hormuz shutdown could send oil prices as high as $200 a barrel in what he called a dreadful shock. Read that again, because that's not a small number. $200 a barrel isn't an escalation. It's a different global economy. Bab el-Mandeb alone carries something like 10% of the world's seaborne oil and gas trade. And if it closed at the same time as Hormuz, independent analysis puts the combined disruption at close to a quarter of the entire planet's energy supply, moving through both choke points simultaneously. Here's why this threat is being taken seriously, rather than dismissed as bluster, and it's worth understanding the mechanics of why. The Houthis have already proven they can do exactly this. During the Israel-Hamas war that began in 2023, they effectively shut down commercial shipping through Bab el-Mandeb for ships they associated with Israel or the United States, forcing insurers to refuse coverage and pushing a huge share of global container traffic to reroute entirely around the southern tip of Africa instead. That's not a hypothetical capability analysts are guessing at. That's a demonstrated track record from the same group being invoked again right now, and the timing lines up with something else worth knowing. A senior advisor to Iran's supreme leader separately repeated a threat this year that the broader network Tehran calls the Axis of Resistance, the loose coalition that includes the Houthis, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and Iranian-aligned Iraqi militias, has the capability to lock both waterways at once. That's not one official freelancing. That's a threat being echoed at multiple levels of the same alliance. But here's the honest, complicating layer. Because a lot of coverage skips straight past this part to get to the scarier headline, and I don't think that's fair to you. Analysts who study this specific dynamic closely have pointed out that Iran and the Houthis have had the capability to fully close Bab el-Mandeb for a while now, and have deliberately chosen not to use it to its maximum extent, even during periods of heavy fighting. The reasoning laid out by regional security analysts comes down to what's been described as three overlapping circles of deterrence holding that decision in check. The first is international. Closing a global maritime artery that carries a meaningful share of trade to and from the Suez Canal isn't treated as a regional skirmish, it's treated as a direct challenge to freedom of navigation, and the US and UK have already shown willingness to use force to keep that specific waterway open in years past. The second is regional. Saudi Arabia has spent real money building an alternative, the East-West pipeline, specifically to reduce its own vulnerability to a Hormuz shutdown, moving oil overland to Red Sea ports instead, and that pipeline was reportedly already running at its full capacity of 7 million barrels a day back when Hormuz first shut down earlier this year. If Bab el-Mandeb closes too, that alternative gets cut off at the exact same time, which raises the stakes for Gulf states in a way that could shift their own calculations about how much pressure to tolerate. And the third circle is local, inside Yemen itself, where the Houthis have their own interest in not fully detonating an asset that also depends on maintaining some control over the western Yemeni coastline they actually govern. So where does that leave the actual risk assessment tonight, stripped of the scariest possible framing? The threat is real in the sense that the capability clearly exists and has been demonstrated before. It has not yet been executed at anywhere close to full scale in this specific phase of the conflict, and multiple regional analysts describe the likelier near-term pattern as calibrated pressure and what's been called mission creep, both sides raising stakes gradually rather than either one committing to fully closing a second global choke point outright. That's a meaningfully different picture than the world's oil supply is about to get cut in half. And I'd rather give you the more boring, more accurate version of that risk than the viral one. If this kind of grounded, sourced breakdown of what's actually happening underneath the headlines is why you keep coming back to this channel, Do me a favor right now and hit subscribe with notifications turned on. This is genuinely one of the fastest moving conflicts I've ever tried to track in real time, and I go through it the same way every single episode. Confirmed statements first, independent satellite and shipping data second, anything genuinely unresolved labeled as unresolved, no borrowed confidence, and no rage bait numbers just because they'd perform better in the algorithm. That's the only way I want this channel to grow. And it's the only way I know how to responsibly cover something where real people are dying in these waters every week. It continues. Let's go back to the nuclear thread now, because it's still running underneath everything else this week, and it might matter more long-term than either strait. President Trump has spent this week publicly threatening a site called Pickaxe Mountain, and if you haven't heard of it before now, you're not behind, because most people hadn't either until a few days ago. Known in Farsi as Ku-e-Kalangazla, Pickaxe Mountain is a fortified underground complex built into a mountain roughly 2 kilometers from the Natanz enrichment complex in central Iran. And according to independent satellite analysis from the Institute for Science and International Security, construction there began around 2020, not long after Iran reported what it called an act of sabotage at Natanz itself. Iran's then nuclear chief said publicly at the time that the country was building a more modern, larger, and more comprehensive hall inside the mountain for producing advanced centrifuges. That's Iran's own stated framing. Independent Western intelligence assessments go further, suspecting the site may also be intended as an undeclared enrichment facility rather than just a manufacturing plant. And the distinction between those two things is enormous because manufacturing centrifuges and actually running enrichment inside a mountain that's essentially been engineered to be unreachable are very different problems for the rest of the world. Here's what makes this site genuinely different from Fordo, the facility everyone already knows from last year's Operation Midnight Hammer. Fordo sits somewhere between roughly 80 and 90 meters underground. Pickaxe Mountain is buried far deeper, with the mountain itself rising more than 4,600 meters above sea level, and independent assessments describe it as potentially even harder to destroy from the air than Fordo was, specifically because it's carved into solid granite rather than the softer geology surrounding some of Iran's other sites. The compound covers roughly a square kilometer of mountainside, with a security perimeter connecting directly to the Natanz complex's own fencing, 2 paved access roads climbing toward the tunnel entrances, and according to the Institute for Science and International Security's most recent imagery. From early July, at least a pair of western tunnel portals still sitting open, which analysts note leaves them vulnerable to precision strikes or even a ground incursion through those same openings. The same basic vulnerability that made Fordo's ventilation shafts the actual point of attack in last year's strike. IAEA inspectors have never been granted access inside Pickaxe Mountain under Iran's safeguards agreement because Iran has never formally declared it as an enrichment site in the first place. And the IAEA's own Director General has previously noted that this facility fits a broader pattern of Iran deliberately pushing its most sensitive nuclear work underground, out of reach of both satellites and inspectors alike. And here's the part that should genuinely concern anyone following the diplomatic side of this conflict rather than just the military one. Under the memorandum Iran signed on June 17th, Tehran explicitly committed to maintaining what the agreement called the current status quo of its nuclear program during negotiations. Independent satellite imagery from late June, though, reportedly showed continued vehicle activity on the roads leading to Pickaxe Mountain's western tunnel entrances, along with signs of ongoing hardening work at the tunnel openings themselves, while Iran simultaneously partially backfilled a separate set of eastern portals and appears to have fully sealed a smaller, older tunnel complex within the same perimeter, one originally built back in 2007. Analysts have specifically flagged that the contents of that sealed older tunnel are unknown, but could plausibly include stores of enriched uranium moved there for safekeeping. To be clear about what is and isn't confirmed here, because this is exactly the kind of place where a lot of coverage just picks the scariest available reading and runs with it. Nobody outside a very narrow intelligence circle has independently verified what's actually happening inside that mountain right now. What's confirmed is the construction activity visible from orbit. What's not confirmed is what that construction is actually building toward, whether it's centrifuge manufacturing exactly as Iran claims, a genuine undeclared enrichment line as Western agencies suspect, or some combination of both running in parallel. That gap between visible activity and confirmed purpose is precisely why Trump has now threatened it directly and publicly, telling one radio interviewer this week that the U.S. has eyes on the site through satellite and space-based assets, and telling reporters separately that Pickaxe is, in his words, a possible target for a big shot right in the front door, adding that America would probably hit it relatively soon. That is about as direct a threat against a named nuclear facility as you'll hear a sitting president make in real time, and it's landing in the middle of an already collapsing ceasefire framework rather than in some hypothetical future scenario. Let's widen the lens now, because this conflict has stopped being contained to Iran's coastline, and the regional spillover this week is its own story entirely. Jordan's armed forces said they intercepted 8 Iranian missiles early Thursday morning, with a military official confirming no casualties and no damage on the ground. Kuwait's military separately reported its air defenses were again confronting attacks by hostile drones launched from Iranian territory. The European Union's Aviation Safety Agency issued a formal advisory this week telling commercial airlines to avoid the airspace of Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, the UAE, and parts of the Gulf of Oman. That advisory is set to remain in place until at least July 29th, which tells you European regulators aren't treating this as a one-week problem. They're treating it as a standing risk for at least the next 2 weeks minimum. And if you want a sense of just how far the actual strike footprint has spread beyond what most coverage frames as the core battle zone, look at Chabahar, a commercial port roughly 200 miles east of the strait itself, where video verified by CBS News this week showed a thick column of smoke rising after American strikes hit the town. This war does not have a tidy front line anymore confined to one stretch of coastline. It has a region, and the region is absorbing hits from multiple directions at once, some of it Iranian retaliation landing in neighboring countries, some of it American strikes reaching well past, where most people assumed the fighting was contained. There's also a genuinely strange thread running alongside all of this violence that's worth understanding, because it complicates any simple story about total breakdown. In the middle of an active blockade and strike campaign, Trump announced this week that Iran had released an American woman, later identified by her attorney as Dina Karari, who had been barred from leaving the country since December of 2024, under what her legal team described as bogus charges. Trump called it a gesture of goodwill. That's a genuinely strange thing for a government to do in the middle of a shooting war with the country holding that blockade against it. And I don't think it cancels out anything happening in the Strait, but it's a real data point. It tells you the diplomatic channels between Washington and Tehran haven't been fully severed even now, at the worst point of this particular escalation, and that matters for how you should read everything else happening this week. A government that's willing to make a unilateral humanitarian gesture in the middle of a war is a government that's still, at some level, managing this as a negotiation with an eventual off-ramp in mind, not purely as a fight to be finished by force alone. Which brings me to something I think deserves more attention than it's getting, because it's the clearest evidence yet of a real internal disagreement inside the American government about how far this actually goes. Vice President J.D. Vance ruled out publicly, on record, sending American ground troops into Iran to force regime change, arguing explicitly that change of that kind has to come from the Iranian people themselves, rather than from a foreign military. He specifically warned against letting Iran collapse into a failed state comparable to Libya, citing the risk of unleashed terrorism and refugee flows spreading into both Europe and the United States, and said flatly that the administration's immediate goals were limited to keeping the Strait of Hormuz open, protecting the flow of oil and gas, and preventing Iran from rebuilding the specific capabilities that make it a threat to that waterway. That's a fairly narrow, contained mission statement coming from the vice president. In the same general window, though, Trump told Fox News that things get, in his words, really bad for Iran next week, specifically threatening to knock out the country's power plants and bridges unless Tehran returns to the negotiating table. Hold those two statements next to each other for a second. One senior official is drawing an explicit line against occupation and forced regime change. The president is threatening to escalate directly into national infrastructure, the kind of target set that goes well beyond degrading coastal military capability and starts touching the civilian economy directly. Those two things aren't necessarily contradictory. A blockade and airstrikes campaign can absolutely stay well short of putting boots on the ground. But it's a real and visible difference in emphasis, and it's exactly the kind of gap worth watching closely over the next several days, rather than assuming the entire American government is reading from one unified script. Let's talk about what's actually going on with Iran's response, and its own internal fractures, because that story hasn't really changed since we last covered this. It's just gotten sharper. Tehran's foreign ministry said this week it has no plans to return to negotiations with the United States, while the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has separately accused Washington of endangering global oil supplies through its own strike campaign. An accusation that's genuinely rich, coming from the side that triggered this entire phase by attacking commercial tankers in the first place. Middle East scholars watching this closely describe Tehran's overall posture right now as trying to transform what started as a bilateral confrontation with Washington into a broader challenge to the sea lanes underpinning global energy trade as a whole, essentially trying to make the rest of the world feel enough economic pain that outside pressure gets applied to Washington to de-escalate. Whether that strategy actually works is genuinely contested among the people who study it. One former U.S. Middle East negotiator framed the entire diplomatic puzzle simply as figuring out how to shift Iran's calculus back toward being willing not just to talk, but to actually land on an arrangement both sides can live with. which is a very different bar than simply getting Tehran back to a table for its own sake. Underneath all of that sits the same structural problem we've flagged before, and it hasn't resolved itself. It's arguably gotten worse. Iran's political negotiators and its military chain of command do not appear to be operating from the same playbook. A government that signs a memorandum promising to maintain the status quo of its nuclear program, while satellite imagery simultaneously shows continued construction at one of its most sensitive undeclared sites, is a government whose signature and whose actual behavior on the ground are not reliably telling the same story. That fracture is exactly what's made previous rounds of this same standoff collapse faster than anyone expected, and there's no strong evidence yet that anything about that underlying dynamic has changed this time around. So here's the honest, unspun state of play, stripped of whatever spin either side wants you to walk away with. The United States has run 5 consecutive days of strikes specifically targeting the coastal and command infrastructure Iran needs to threaten shipping through Hormuz, layered a full naval blockade directly on top of that campaign, and specifically gone after the economic lifeline at Kharg Island rather than only the military hardware. It has simultaneously floated commercial trade incentives to the Gulf states standing next to Iran, released a detained American citizen through diplomatic channels that clearly haven't fully shut down, and now has a sitting president publicly threatening to strike one of Iran's most fortified and least understood nuclear sites, a facility deliberately built deep enough that even independent nuclear analysts aren't fully certain what a strike there could or couldn't accomplish. Iran, for its part, has pushed missile and drone attacks outward into Jordan and Kuwait, is holding rhetorically to the position that it still controls passage through its own waters, even though actual shipping data says traffic through the strait has collapsed to a fraction of normal, has apparently continued construction at an undeclared nuclear site, in what independent analysts describe as a clear violation of the very agreement its own negotiators signed a month ago, and has now, through its allies in Yemen, floated the idea of putting a second global choke point on the table entirely. 56 confirmed attacks and 17 confirmed deaths in this specific phase alone tell you this stopped being a war of statements a while ago, regardless of who's technically winning the messaging fight on state television versus cable news. Where this actually goes from here depends heavily on a few genuinely open questions nobody outside a small circle in Washington and Tehran can answer with confidence right now. Whether Trump's threat against Pickaxe Mountain is a negotiating lever meant to force Iran back to the table, or a strike that's actually coming in the near term regardless of what Tehran does next. Whether the Bab el-Mandeb threat stays exactly where analysts currently place it, a calibrated pressure card being waved rather than played, or whether continued Saudi strikes on Yemen and continued American pressure on Iran push the Houthis past the point where those 3 circles of deterrence still hold. Whether the fracture between Iran's political class and its Revolutionary Guard finally produces the kind of accident that neither side intended, given how many missiles, drones, and now naval assets are all operating simultaneously in an increasingly crowded and contested stretch of water and airspace, and whether the quieter diplomatic thread, the released detainee, the redirected shipping fee, the continued back-channel contact, ends up mattering more than the louder military one once both sides tire of the current pace. I'd rather leave you with that honest uncertainty than hand you a clean resolution. The actual sourcing doesn't support right now. Drop a comment telling me what you want broken down next. Whether that's a full technical deep dive on what a strike against a target buried as deep as Pickaxe Mountain would actually require, compared to what worked at Fordo last year, a closer look at exactly how the Saudi East-West pipeline works as a Hormuz workaround, and what happens if that gets cut off too, or a different angle on this conflict entirely that you think isn't getting enough attention. I read every comment, and a meaningful share of what ends up covered on this channel starts right there in that comment section. Thanks for watching, and I'll be back the moment there's something real to report, not just something loud.